You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record. My guest, Rob Clark, has been researching John F. Kennedy's assassination for 30 years. His podcast, the Lone Gunman Podcast, separates myth from fact, all in Rob's laid-back Southern style. It's a favorite podcast of mine, and I'm delighted to have him as a guest. Welcome, Rob Clark. What got you interested in researching JFK?
Oh, man. I think like a lot of people, it was probably around the time that the movie, Oliver Stone's movie JFK came out. In high school, I had to do a paper on President Kennedy. I kind of got my toe in the water there, the aspect of a possible conspiracy. I didn't really think about it much before then. And then after I saw the movie, it just ignited a fire in me. It's just like, okay, here we go. And I haven't looked back since.
Were you afraid of being labeled as kind of a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist?
Personally, no. I don't really care what other people think about me. I wear the term conspiracy theorist as a badge of honor for the most part. I'd like to think that I'm not one of those kooky, crazy ones, but you never know what people think about me. But I don't care. I just do my thing and just move on.
Why is it a badge of honor?
If that's what people want to call me for questioning the official story of events. Of course, my focus is with the JFK assassination, but there's lots of other people who focus on UFOs and Bigfoot and 9/11 and Oklahoma City. Are we conspiracy theorists? Maybe. I mean, all it means is that we think that maybe more than one person was involved in it. That's the true definition of a conspiracy. So is it a bad thing? Not really. I mean, it's just, that's what we think. Of course, you have to be open-minded enough to understand that, okay, if there's some evidence that comes out that somebody has a real clear picture of Lee Harvey Oswald sitting in the 6th floor window of the depository, then I would change my mind, but we don't have that yet. So
what are you looking at? Are you looking at the released documents? Are you reading books? I'm just trying to find out, how do you know what's a good source, what's true, what's not true? And also, when you're looking at all this redacted material, does it get frustrating?
Well, yeah, of course it does. I mean, this whole thing with the JFK documents and the files and the redactions but yeah, it is frustrating. I spend most of my time in document archives. I think that's where you can find the most accurate information you're going to get. When it comes to books that people have written about the assassination, I am very wary about certain things because generally these authors have a agenda that they tend to push, or they have a pet theory that they believe in so much that they won't listen to anything else. Or they have a garage full of these books that they haven't sold in the last 20 years that they're still pushing the theory. Every once in a while you'll get good books, but I'm very selective about the books that I take the time to read. I would recommend any of John Newman's books. He relies heavily on documents to do his books. But people with just a theory, I try to stay away from that.
What is the official narrative of the JFK assassination as outlined by the Warren Report?
Well, the official story is that this 23-year-old loser, lone nut, who was having problems at home, decided one day to take his rifle into work and sit up on the 6th floor at lunchtime and take 3 shots at the president as he was passing by his place of work. That he made his egress from the building and went home, changed clothes, and then proceeded to kill a Dallas police officer on his way to the Texas Theater to watch a movie. And that was where he ended up being arrested. When this happened, back then we were in the height of the Cold War. To have Lee Harvey Oswald, I mean, they had him on film in New Orleans handing out pro-Castro leaflets. So to have this guy tied to that, coupled with the fact that he had defected to Russia and brought back a Russian wife, did not look good. I mean, it kind of tied him in with communism and being a commie. And if this is the guy that killed the president, well then, you could tie him to Castro or Russia being behind the assassination. So our government wanted to quell those concerns, and a commission was created to prove that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin, just a crazy nut guy who did it all on his own without any help from Castro or Russia, or the fact that his Marxist beliefs made him do it. That's pretty much the official story till we get to the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigation. Most people don't know was a second investigation into the murder of President Kennedy, and to which they decided that it was a probable conspiracy, including more people than just Lee Harvey Oswald. And they maintained that most of that evidence came from auditory. There was a motorcycle that radio got stuck down. So it recorded the shots on a dictabelt recording. And then they analyzed this and determined that, there was at least 4 shots, and at least one of them came from the grassy knoll area. HSCA decided there was a probable conspiracy involving more persons than just Oswald.
Isn't it interesting? Because whenever you look up a video on YouTube on the JFK assassination, you get the little official Wikipedia message.
Oh, yeah.
And they don't mention that the most recent investigation done by our government says it was a conspiracy.
Yeah, well, welcome to the controlled narrative.
Yeah, right. It's very interesting.
To your point, I think, it is interesting that anytime you look something up, you get the official curated version of the assassination per Wikipedia, which anybody can edit, and certain threads or discussions are moderated very heavily when it comes to any kind of conspiracy related material.
It's interesting because we had the 50th anniversary of JFK's assassination, and it was the same kind of thing. Every mainstream media station came and said, Oswald did it alone. Too bad history was changed because of one man. Almost every station, yet most of the public doesn't believe that. Do you know what the most recent poll was? The last time they asked the public if they believed Oswald did it alone?
Yeah, I think it was up somewhere around 71 or 72% stated that they thought it was a conspiracy, which is pretty high.
What do you think happened? What is your theory?
Oh, well, I definitely think it was a conspiracy. I think Oswald was set up, as he said, as a patsy or fall guy, if you will. I believe rogue elements of our government could possibly have been involved with complete deniability and distance from the actual operators, of course.
Before we get into Oswald, I just want to talk about the Warren Report just very briefly. There's been criticisms of the Warren Report that they investigated witnesses in groups, that they interrupted Zapruder, who took the film of the assassination that's so famous, the Life magazine film. They cut him off when he suggested that there might be more than 2 gunmen, and that they made the Warren Report. We're familiar usually with the condensed version, but the official version was how many crazy amount of volumes that they made it exceedingly long to discourage the American public to read it, including things like Jack Ruby's mother's dental records in it, just to pad it. What do you do you think that's a fair criticism of the investigation?
Absolutely. Alan Dulles is famously quoted as saying, Americans just don't read. They're never going to read this. They only printed so many copies, and it was 26 volumes of supporting material to the 800-page Warren Report. And you're right. When it comes to the way that witnesses were interviewed and dealt with, it was very suspect. They would go off the record frequently and stop the interview and then come back on. And then, of course, they were doing pre-interviews before they actually went on the record so that they kind of had an idea what the person was going to say and lead them in certain directions. And we also have evidence of tampering with witnesses' statements. Not to get in the weeds too much, but there was a pretty important witness. Author Barry Ernest wrote a book about a couple of years ago entitled The Girl on the Stairs. And this was about Vicki Adams, who was a book depository employee that was on the 4th floor at the time of the assassination. And her and one of her girlfriends, about 30 seconds after the shots rang out, they both headed out and went down the back stairway and went down and outside to see what was going on. And this would have been the prime opportune moment that Oswald should have been running down these stairs from the 6th floor to the 2nd floor, where he was allegedly encountered in the lunchroom. David Beelan, one of the attorneys for the Warren Commission, was caught red-handed. When Barry Ernest showed her Warren Commission testimony all these years later, she distinctly remembers that she did not answer in this way and that they twisted her words around and even had her meeting two other employees on the first floor that she didn't see because that changed her timing. They said, oh, she must have been mistaken about when she went down those back stairs. But it turns out that she was absolutely right. She went down there with one of her other friends, and her supervisor followed them out to the stairwell, to the fourth floor stairway, as they descended and stayed there for a couple minutes before she went back into the fourth floor offices. She never encountered Oswald coming down the stairs either. So either this guy was lightning fast, okay, or Oswald never, or nobody ever descended those back stairs from the sixth floor, but nobody came down, period. So, and they knew that they had a problem with this, and they made a big deal of it, you know, when dealing with Victoria Adams and her testimony presented a problem, and they fixed it the only way they knew how, which was to alter her testimony, which to me is insane. So yeah, very disingenuous stuff with the Warren Commission. I don't put much faith in anything that came out of the Warren Commission findings.
Can you find all 26 volumes today?
If you're lucky. I tell you what, a couple of years ago, I was at this used bookstore in Frederick, Maryland. I used to stop in there all the time because they had cheap used books on the assassination, because Harold Weisberg used to live in Frederick. There was a big section in there. So I'd go in there and you'd find an assassination book for like $3 or $4, which was, hey, cool deal. But then they had another section where they had very rare or autographed or first edition copies of different assassination books, autographed Harold Weisberg books and things. And I noticed they had a full set of the Warren Commission 26 volumes for $750.
Wow.
And this was probably 10 years ago. They're very hard to find. If you can find a complete set in good condition, you're going to pay for it for sure. Much cheaper to go on Amazon and get the CD-ROM.
Is that the way to do it? Because I got the condensed version at a thrift bookstore, and my sister-in-law said to me as a dunk, sort of like, well, there's no reference to Ruby's mother's teeth in here. I'm like, yes, because it's the condensed version. It's not the 26 volume version. It's quite a bit condensed now. What do we know about who Oswald was? What was he doing in New Orleans, and how did he get to Dallas?
Yeah, well, Lee Harvey Oswald is a very odd duck. I will say that. And probably totally because of his mother. He grew up without a father. His father died before he was born. He was the youngest of two brothers. He had two older brothers. He was, I think, placed in an orphanage sometime when he was very young because his mother couldn't take care of him. She ended up getting him back out of the orphanage, though. But she tended to move around a lot. They would frequently move back and forth between New Orleans and Fort Worth and Dallas. And then, he decides to follow his brother's footsteps and go in the Marine Corps as soon as he turned 17. And he ends up getting stationed at a CIA base in Atsugi, Japan, where they're flying the U-2 flights out of over Russia. So he's kind of privileged to some top secret information concerning these U-2 flights. And then, lo and behold, his mother is getting a candy jar off the shelf, and it busts in her face. So he requests, an early dismissal from the Marine Corps, which he gets.
Wait, hold on.
Yes.
Hold on. A candy jar busts in her face? What does that mean? Like, she's getting a candy jar down off the shelf and the glass breaks and it explodes? Is that what happened?
Yes. Yeah, it hits her in the face, basically.
Okay. Watch out for those candy jars. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But that was his basis for getting out of the Marines early. So he goes back, supposedly, he gets out of the Marines to go take care of his poor mother who had this horrible accident. But he only hangs around for 3 days before he hops on a steamship headed for Europe. He makes his way via England, France, I think Finland, and then crossing there near Helsinki into Russia and making his way to Moscow, where he defects or tries to. He doesn't really defect officially because they just hold his paperwork and passport, but the Russians let him stay. They give him a job, and he meets Marina and falls instantly in love, apparently, because they were married 3 weeks after they met. So,
what was Marina's background?
Well, it's interesting. Marina happened to meet 3 different American defectors have relationships with two of them, and marry one of them in the entire gigantic country of Russia.
Hey, Rob, she had a type.
Yeah. Yeah, she had a type, all right. I think she was told what type to have, if you know what I'm saying.
I know.
She gets stuck on him, and he gets enamored with her, and he ends up getting her pregnant, and probably tells her how great life is in America, and blah, blah, blah. They end up moving back to the United States in, I think it's late 61 or early 62, trying to make a life here with his family.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, he just defected in the height of Cold War, and he comes right back. And America's like, oh, you're back.
Yeah.
How did it work out? Oh, welcome back home. We love communist defectors in this country.
Yeah, at the height of the Cold War. When he defected, a lot of newspapers around the country were saying, hey, Texas man defects. It was big news. But apparently not so big when he came back, because apparently he was ignored by the FBI and the CIA when he returned and was not debriefed. I think the FBI did debrief him when he finally got back to Texas, and they started watching him after that. But you would think the CIA would have definitely wanted to talk to him. And they probably did. We just don't have an official record of it. A lot of people believe that his defection was part of an intelligence project. That's just the only way it kind of makes sense to me.
Agreed. Yeah.
So I think that he was sent over there to glean what he could glean. I mean, you got to remember, this is behind the Iron Curtain back then, before we had, real good satellites up in the air. We were flying U-2s over there, but you can only see so much. So to have somebody with boots on the ground behind the Iron Curtain would be a big asset for the Central Intelligence Agency for sure back then.
Why do people think that there were doubles of Oswald walking around?
Because he was in so many places at the same time. I don't necessarily agree with John Armstrong's conclusion, but his book, Harvey and Lee, is chock full of documentation. I mean, this is even going back to his childhood in school, where he was enrolled at two schools at the same time. He was supposed to be in New York, but he's enrolled in 9th grade or 8th grade in Texas at the same time. And then it follows to his military career, where he's supposedly in two different places at the same time. We have documentation from the government saying he's here and then saying he's here at the same time, totally somewhere else. And then, of course, this follows to when he returns to America. You have instances like in Dallas where he was seen in certain places. He was seen at a rifle range. He was test driving a car. He was supposed to be at work at this time. So it couldn't have been the Oswald. It had to be somebody using Oswald identification to make this guy memorable before the events of November 22nd happened. So very odd behavior, sure.
And what do we know about Oswald's movements on November 22nd, the day of JFK's assassination?
Well, he went home with Bill Frazier the Thursday night before the Friday assassination. And he normally didn't do this. He normally, if he was going back to Irving, because him and his wife were separated at the time, and his wife Marina was living with Ruth Payne in Irving, Texas.
The Quakers.
So, yeah.
I was raised Quaker, so yeah, they've always been an interesting figure for me, the Paynes.
Yeah, so keep in mind, okay, already had one child, right? June. And then Marina was pregnant and just had a baby in October of 1963. Had their second child named Rachel Oswald. So she had just had a baby a month before the assassination. So Oswald would sometimes go back to Irving on the weekends to see his family because they had moved back to Texas. Well, Ruth Payne had came to New Orleans at the end of September and took Marina back to Texas. And this is when, and left Oswald in New Orleans. And he allegedly the next day traveled to Mexico City. And then made his way back to Dallas after that, a week or so after Marina was taken back there by Ruth Payne.
What do you think the point of that was, to move Marina back and forth?
Well, they were supposedly having marital issues, not getting along, arguing, Marina not being happy and Oswald not being happy. And then they have the FBI hounding them, visiting Oswald's job and questioning things about him. And one of the FBI agents, James Hosty, who was assigned Oswald in Dallas in 1963, stated that they were more interested in Marina than Lee Oswald, because a lot of these women that came back as wives to American people from Russia were in fact Russian spies. So
right.
they were kind of keeping an eye on the Oswalds and what they were doing. So yeah, it gets kind of crazy. And then of course Oswald is accused of going into the FBI office there in Dallas about a week or two before the assassination and going off in there and leaving a note basically saying, hey, leave my wife alone, or I'll do something, or blow the building up, or whatever the case may be. But of course the note was lost and flushed down the toilet. So we don't know exactly what it said.
Wow. Interesting. Would there be any benefit to saying that they were having marital trouble if they weren't?
No, but if the Paynes, specifically Ruth Payne, because they weren't living together either at the time, Ruth and Michael. So if Ruth Payne was a quote unquote babysitter to watch Marina, of course she would have been in Marina's ear, kind of placing a wedge, maybe saying things like, yeah, your husband, he's worthless. Look at, he can't even support his family, blah, blah, blah. You'll never have anything if you're with this guy, Who knows what she was saying? If it was her place to kind of quarantine Marina and drive a wedge in between them, because I think if you have Lee and Marina together and having a happy life, then he doesn't have a reason to be this crazy, lone nut, disgruntled president killer.
Right. So the president's shot, he's in the book depository. What happens after, where does he go from the book depository after the assassination? Where does he go?
This is a fun story. So, of course, the assassination happens about 12:31 p.m. Dallas time, right? Nobody sees Oswald, allegedly, after 11:30 a.m. that morning. The next time he is seen, allegedly, is in the lunchroom approximately 90 seconds after the assassination takes place, where he's encountered by a police officer and the superintendent of the school book depository building. The superintendent tells the cop, oh no, that guy's okay, he works here. And they proceed to go on up the stairs and search the rest of the building. And then Oswald is supposed to make his way out the front door of the depository that we happen to have no photographs of or film whatsoever, which would be nice, but we do not.
What about this Oswald in the doorway picture?
Oh, don't get me started. That's one of the famous frauds of the JFK community.
Okay.
It was concocted, and it goes back to the 60s. It's just been resurrected like a zombie that just won't die over the years, where there's a worker named Billy Lovelady who kind of resembles Lee Oswald. And he's seen in one of the famous Auction 6 photographs, and it's kind of focused on the doorway of the depository. And he kind of looks like Lee Oswald, but you can clearly tell it's not. But of course, people allege that it was a 1963 version of photoshopping done. But yeah, no, that's just another depository worker named Billy Lovelady in there.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah. So then, when Oswald's leaving the building, okay, he supposedly he's on foot now. And he walks down Houston Street, down to Main Street, and heads up Main Street. And he heads about 7 blocks down and hops on a bus. And so he gets on the bus, and it just so happens, of all the people in Dallas, Texas, that a former landlady that he had just stayed with, one of her rooming house rooms, a month and a half prior, happened to be on the bus. Okay, so she identifies him as, oh yeah, I saw him, he was on the bus, and this, that, and the other. So anyway, the bus was having trouble.
Wait, if you just assassinated the president, is it smart to get on a bus or not smart? Smart because I guess everybody would be upset. You would hope nobody would notice you hiding in plain sight. But there's so many people who could ID you, just like his old landlady.
Yeah, probably not the best getaway plan.
It seems not wise to me.
My feeling is that I think that he could not find Buell Frazier, who was his ride. That's my inclination, because what Frazier says, and of course he was another depository worker who was actually arrested the same day because he brought Oswald to work. But Frazier has stated that after the assassination, he just stood there on the steps for a while, kind of taking everything in, and then decided to go to the basement and eat lunch for whatever reason by himself. So my feeling is that Oswald couldn't find him. So at that point, what are you going to do? You're either going to walk way back to Oak Cliff, or you need to go hop on the bus or get a taxi at that point. So that's probably why he walked until he could catch a bus. But then, of course, they're getting stuck in all this traffic because traffic's not moving because the assassination just happened. So Oswald gets a bus transfer. He gets off the bus and walks to the Greyhound station, where he gets into a taxi cab, who then takes him to his rooming house on Beckley. but not straight there. They go 7 blocks past his rooming house and gets dropped off. So he has to walk all the way back 7 blocks to his rooming house. So we approximate this time due to his landlady who was there when he came in. She said he came in the door at about 1 o'clock and he left about 5 minutes after. Okay. And while he was in there, she heard 2 horn honks. She calls it tit tit, right?
Uh-huh.
She gets up and looks out and sees a cop car sitting out there, a Dallas police car. She doesn't know the number, so she's friendly or familiar with certain cop cars, I guess, because of the riffraff they have at this rooming house. But she doesn't recognize the car, so she just sits back down. Well, Oswald comes back out, being nosy landlady that she is. She looks back out the window and she sees Oswald standing on the corner, apparently waiting for a bus. And this was approximately at 1:05. So she sees Oswald standing out there at 1:05. And then we have the murder of JD Tippett, who was a Dallas police officer.
Wait, I'm so confused. Yeah. Who were the people beeping at him?
Well, by the time he had went out the door, the cop car had already left.
So does that mean that they had already were on to him by then? They were looking for him for that reason? For the assassination?
I don't know. That's one of the big mysteries. Yeah, we don't know if it was Tippett or if it was some other random cop cars there that were supposed to meet up with him or something. Who knows? But the next sequence of events is he has to travel, I forget how many blocks away that this Tippett murder happened from his rooming house, but it would have been a good 10 to 12 minute walk, a brisk walk, not running, because nobody said they saw him running. So then you have him getting to the Tippett murder scene at approximately, I think Tippett's official time of death was 1:16, but a lot of the eyewitnesses placed it much closer to 1:06 or 1:10.
Why would he have shot Tippett?
Well, I don't think he did. I don't think he could have got there to the crime scene walking. Now, if he got there via bus or somebody picked him up, then sure, he could have been there by that time. But if he was walking, and people said that they saw him walking in that direction, but he couldn't have got there by the time that the Tippett was murdered. So it all makes no sense whatsoever. And then for him to supposedly leave his wallet at the crime scene and leave a bunch of shells at the crime scene with his fingerprints on them, allegedly, it doesn't make much sense. And then, to take off his jacket as he's running away and hide it under a car, it just all smells of a setup.
I've just never understood the Tippett part of this. I guess it's just to say that he was on the run and he was fleeing and he was scared of law enforcement. If somebody wanted to frame him for this murder and to have a way for them to find him, right, by his ID left at the scene, is that that would be the idea?
Right.
But why would he? Is that what he said when you got to the movie theater? I'm sorry, I can't pay for my ticket. I was killing a cop by my rooming house. So you're just going to have to let me in?
He had money in his pocket. He could have paid for the
Thank you. You're right.
movie ticket, but he chooses to just run in there. But yeah, the whole Tippett thing is very interesting because there's witnesses that Tippett was sitting in his squad car right over the Houston Street Viaduct in a Good Luck Oil Company gas station. And this would have been the route that Oswald should have been driving past or walking past to get back to his rooming house if he took the right way in the right direction at the right time. And they said that Tippett was just sitting there in his car and waiting and didn't get out. And then all of a sudden just tore out of there squealing wheels. And then we have Tippett pulling random vehicles over and looking in them. And then we have a report from the Top 10 record store that said that Tippett came in there and made a phone call and he didn't say anything. So they don't know if anybody answered on the other end. And then he hung up the phone, didn't say anything to him, and left again. And then the next time we see Tippett, he's laying dead at the corner of 10th and Patton. I mean, if you look at the Tippett assassination crime scene witness list, it's like 15 people long. I mean, so many people saw this go down.
Wow.
And yet only a handful identified them as Oswald. Some even said there was 2 people there. And some were coerced in the lineup, to identify Oswald. Of course, he's in there with a holy T-shirt and, 3 other guys with like nice shirts and ties on. So not very hard to pick out the perp here with his black eye and his torn T-shirt.
With the people who said that they were coerced to pick Oswald, coerced in what way?
Well, they said, so they'd be sitting there at the lineup. I'm not sure, they're sitting here. Well, it could be number 3 and And the cops would say, "Are you sure it's not number 2? The number 2 man?" And she's like, "Well, maybe." And also, you're saying it's number 2, the number 2 man, right?
Right. Okay. I see what you mean.
That's
okay.
how it kind of went down.
Right.
And of course, like I said, his appearance at the lineup was not very fair, to say the least.
Why do you think he was going to the movies? Why do you think he didn't pay for his ticket if he had the money? What is your theory about it? And what are you basing that theory on?
Well, very interesting. There happened to be someone in the movie theater. There was, I think, 6 or 7 patrons in the movie theater, watching the movie. Okay. I mean, it's the middle of work day. Not very many people are there. And they're kind of all spread out in the theater. Nobody's really sitting together. And ironically enough, we don't have the complete list of the movie theater witnesses who allegedly witnessed this scuffle between Oswald and the cops and his arrest. We only know of, I think, 2 patrons who were in the theater, and the rest of the list is lost, or nobody's found it since. No interviews, no nothing, except for these 2 people. And one of them is a fellow by the name of George Applin, who was very young at the time. He was about 18 or 19 years old. He was interviewed by the Warren Commission, and he told them, what he saw in there. And I don't know how accurate his Warren Commission testimony was, but for the HSCA, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he was re-interviewed, and he told a little bit of a different story than he did in 1963. Because at the time that all this went down in the theater, he didn't know by sight anybody in the theater. He didn't know him. He didn't know anybody until 2 days later. Okay. So when he was re-interviewed in 1978 for the House Select Committee, he proceeded to tell this story of what he saw in the theater. That he said they beat Oswald in the back with a shotgun, that Oswald grabbed an officer's pistol off of his hip and tried to hit him with it, which is different. We've all heard, he went back to the rooming house to get this revolver to kill Tippett. Okay. This guy that was in the theater said, no, it was Oswald pulled this revolver off of the cop because they were beating the hell out of him inside of the theater. They were asking him, did you shoot the president? And he's saying, I didn't shoot anybody. And they're just beating the hell out of him. So then this guy, George Applin, okay, he states he got up. He was sitting kind of 7 rows up from the back of the theater. He said Oswald must have been there before he got there because he never saw Oswald come in and sit down. So he stands up and looks around, and he sees there's a guy sitting in the very back row of the theater. So he goes back and touches the guy on the shoulder. He says, hey, man, you might want to get down. He said, they're waving guns around and stuff. And the guy just looks at him, doesn't say anything, and just keeps kind of watching what's happening. Okay, so, he doesn't think anything of it at the time. Like I said, until 2 days later, when the person that shot Lee Harvey Oswald, his face is plastered all over television and news. And that man is Jack Ruby. So George Applin is saying that Jack Ruby was in the theater when Oswald was arrested. Okay.
Wow. Is he saying that he's just realizing that now? Is he giving a reason for why he left it out of his original statement?
Well, like I said, at the time of his original police statement, he didn't know who it was.
Okay.
Now, of course, by the time his Warren Commission testimony came around in 1964, he did know, but he didn't say anything because he was scared because all these other assassination witnesses were dying. So he said he chose to keep his mouth shut. And he said, but by 1978, he figured it was about as safe as it was going to be. All these other people are dead by then. He could safely come out and tell his story. So possibly Oswald was going to meet Jack Ruby at the theater for whatever reason.
It seems like he was going to meet someone because, right? I don't know. It just seems so odd. Why wouldn't he pay for the ticket? It just seemed like there was some plan in there. I don't know what, but some plan, right?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And I think there's some problems with the girl that was at the ticket-taking booth. It seemed like she may have been coerced in her story because if he doesn't sneak into the movies, the cops are never called, right?
Right.
So there has to be a reason for the cops to swarm that theater. And without that happening, they don't have a clue where he is.
What do we know about Jack Ruby? I think one of the more interesting figures of this whole story.
Oh, for sure. He's a trip, man. Fascinating guy. And here's what I think. I think he definitely had mafia connection.
Wait, first, before we get into what you think, yeah. I just want to know what we know for sure about Jack Ruby. What's been established as fact. And then we can get into your theory.
Allegedly, Jack Ruby shot Oswald so Jackie Kennedy would not have to come back to Dallas to testify at his trial. He felt it was his patriotic duty.
What was his business, Jack Ruby?
Well, his business, he was a nightclub owner. He had owned and ran several nightclubs. He was a former military guy. I think he was in the Army at one point. Going back even, he grew up on the mean streets of Chicago, very poor, fell in with the wrong crowd, even working for Al Capone at some point, not directly, but as like way, way under capos and underbosses and everything at street level stuff. And then he joined the military, did his service, came back, moved to Dallas where his sister was running a nightclub. So he got into the nightclub business. At the time, I think he owned one called the Silver Spur and the Carousel Club. This Carousel Club was a strip joint, kind of a seedy place, and lots of cops would hang out there. And I've heard some crazy stories about Jack Ruby, his dancers, and what he was involved with. Then you have him stalking. And you can, if you step back and you look at Jack Ruby's movements from the time that Oswald is arrested until he shoots him, he's stalking him. I mean, we have pictures of Ruby at the police station after Oswald is arrested in the hallway. And then we have pictures of Jack Ruby at the midnight press conference correcting DA Henry Wade about the Fair Play for Cuba committee. He had his glasses on and he had press credentials.
He's like Zelig. He's like everywhere. He's like in every picture, right? Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And then finally, he's running all around Dallas when he's not there, doing God knows what, until finally the last moment to where he can be able to take out Oswald, he does it. He jumps out of a sea of reporters in the basement of the Dallas Police headquarters there, manages to get one good lucky shot into Oswald's gut. Oswald dies from his injury, and Jack Ruby's arrested, tried, and found guilty. But he was given a retrial, which he never got to see, and ended up dying 4 years later in prison.
How did that happen? His conviction got vacated for technical reasons, and they were going to retry him? Is that what happened?
Well, I think it was a combination of things. I know his attorneys moved to get a new trial because of location. I think they didn't believe that he got a fair trial in Dallas, which is probably true. Also, I think that evidence was introduced into that case that should not have been admissible, which is a confession before he was given his Miranda rights. So I think those two things combined set him up nicely for a new trial.
It's just interesting, like little tidbits come up. I was reading Anita O'Day, the jazz singer's book, and she was talking about singing in Dallas. Like many jazz singers, she had developed a heroin problem, and she said, oh, when I was in Dallas, I was warned about Jack Ruby and his connections with the Dallas PD. She even writes in it, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I was warned, because she didn't want to lose her cabaret license. She didn't want to be busted for drugs in that club.
Right.
So it's just kind of interesting that there's like little pieces of information about this story that sort of filter in through other areas.
Probably no coincidence that if Jack Ruby was in that Texas theater, that, he would have been like, hey guys, let me get the hell out of here. And the witness list disappeared.
Right.
He could have blended in, or a cop could have let him in. Anything could happen. He managed to finally shoot him at the last possible second. Because like I've always said, murdering someone in cold blood on television when you've never killed anybody before in your life, okay, that's a heavy decision to make. You're basically saying, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to shoot this guy, and I'm throwing my life away. I'm done with life. Because you're going to get caught. You're going to get thrown in prison. Now, you might have some delusional idea that they might let me out as a hero patriot or something like that. But what are the odds of that happening?
Slim to none.
Yeah. More likely scenario is that Ruby was compromised and he had to do what he did, or else they were going to kill him or his sister or his dogs who he loved like children. So who knows?
Yeah, it's impossible to know what he was promised. He seemed awfully calm for the whole situation, just hanging out there, waiting, just chilling out. And he kept saying, move me and I'll say everything, right? At the end of his life.
Yeah. Yeah, he was saying, get me out of Dallas and I'll tell you whatever you want to know. But they never would get him out of Dallas.
Did they ever have a reason for that?
They saw no need to take him to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I was just wondering if they had a cover story. I mean, obviously, the inference from that is that they don't want him to talk, so they don't want to move him.
They came to him instead of bringing him to them. He even took a lie detector test and all this jazz. But he said a couple like ominous statements, like you just said, after he was convicted. There's even talk that he was visited by Jolly and West, the famous MKUltra psychologist, while he's in prison. And then all of a sudden he's going crazy, seeing visuals of Jews burning in hell and all this other crazy stuff going on, and where he's running around in a cell banging his head on the wall. So who knows if Dr. Jolly West dosed this guy with LSD
or hypnosis. I mean, don't even discount the power of hypnosis.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And he was pretty much the master of that.
Oh yeah.
I remember when I was interviewing O'Neill's book about Manson, he has a part about Jolly and West and his interview with Ruby.
Yeah, what's interesting, that he messed with Sirhan, Charles Manson, Jack Ruby, all these high-profile killers, supposedly. And when you look at Jack Ruby and even Charles Manson, and even Sirhan to an extent, they were somehow massively dosed with LSD to make them a little, or like you said, hypnotizing them. It all kind of makes sense a little bit when you're looking at the MKUltra stuff. So,
did you ever see that explanation that Garrison made that Ruby was in Oswald's phone book, or was it the other way around?
Yeah, I did see that, but it was some kind of a coded way. They found like a coded way that his number was in there.
What do you think of that?
I think it's a stretch. I think much like A.J. Weberman's book, The Oswald Code, he basically goes through Oswald's address book and decodes it page by page like he was some master cryptologist, which I doubt. But yeah, you can find anything hard enough when you're looking at numbers and letters, when you start getting into gematria and this means that and da-da-da, and you can find whatever you're looking for, basically. And I think that it was a huge stretch on Garrison's part to fall into all that back then. But of course, he didn't turn down much.
What most people know about JFK's assassination is probably through the Oliver Stone's movie, which is based on Garrison's book, On the Trail of the Assassins. What do you think about Garrison's investigation? He was the DA of New Orleans. Who funded it? And what was his theory?
Some of it was privately funded. And I forget what the committee was called that Mark Lane formed for him, that they were getting donations to fund the investigation. I think he was on to something early when it comes to the Jack Martin and David Ferrie allegations. The day after the assassination, this private investigator, in quotes, if you will, Jack Martin, went to the FBI and he said, look, I know this guy. His name's David Ferrie. He was in Oswald's Civil Air Patrol thing. He taught Oswald how to shoot a rifle. I've seen a photo with them together. I know Ferrie went to Texas recently. You might want to go look at this guy. So the FBI, 3 days after the assassination, interviews David Ferrie. And they go through all this, and I guess he paints them a nice picture, and they drop it. They didn't see anything there. Yeah. So a couple years later, when Garrison is turned on to some of the facts of the case, and he comes across this Jack Martin and David Ferrie and the allegations, and it trips something in him to start investigating stuff, because Oswald was in New Orleans the summer before the assassination. So he feels like he has the right to investigate this and to see if there was any connections here. Unfortunately for him, David Ferrie died in 1960, was it 65 or 67, at home in bed, and left 2 very weird suicide letters.
2?
He left 2 different ones. Yeah, one was still on the typewriter and the other one was already done. I guess they said he overdosed on pills or had an adverse reaction or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think that was his ultimate goal, was to get David Ferrie to admit to his role in whatever was going on down there in New Orleans, because Ferrie could be tied back to like Guy Bannister's office.
He had cancer and he was trying to cure himself with mice. Is that just the way it's portrayed in the? I didn't even know if that was too accurate in the movie.
Yeah, I don't know about that part of it. He claimed to be a lot of things. David Ferrie did, master hypnotist, a priest, a pilot, an investigator, a CIA agent, making night runs into Cuba to rescue people, and who knows the real truth. So I think Garrison got fixated on Clay Shaw. It turned out he was right about Clay Shaw having CIA ties, but he wasn't necessarily a CIA agent or asset. He was just someone who as part of whatever kind of CIA program. I can't remember what the code name for it was, but where they would interview businessmen, prominent businessmen, who were returning from overseas visits to various countries and kind of debrief them about what was going on in that foreign country. Clay Shaw was the head of the international trademark, so he did a lot of international traveling. And he would basically, for I think a period of 8 years, he was used and debriefed by the CIA just to see whatever information he could give them about whatever country he had just come back from. So that all turned out to be true through declassified documents. Garrison was on the right track, but as far as him being involved in the Kennedy assassination, I think it's highly suspect. I'm glad Garrison did what he did, because if he hadn't, a lot of good material and witness testimony came out of the investigation for sure. And I think that we're a lot better off for it as a research community. But whether or not Garrison was on the right trail of the assassin, I don't think so.
That's interesting. What do you think is the most important piece of information or piece of evidence that came out of Garrison's investigation?
Probably, I think the testimony of Pierre Fink, who was one of the Bethesda Naval Hospital autopsy doctors. You know, we know the two famous ones, Humes and Boswell, who did the autopsy on President Kennedy, but they weren't experts on wound ballistics. So they called in Dr. Pierre Fink to help them in the autopsy because he was a professional. And I think Garrison got him on the stand and got him to admit certain things that had been omitted from the Warren Commission report. And Fink gave his analysis on the wound ballistics, and it was kind of an eye-opening thing.
Why was it eye-opening and what was missed?
I think he came forward with the fact that he believed that the shot in his neck could have been an entrance wound and not an exit wound, that they created a trachea opening in.
Right.
That was a big point of contention. Plus, there was a wound in Kennedy's back that was very shallow. It was definitely a bullet hole, but it was very shallow. You know, it didn't go in but maybe half an inch. So that's very odd. And of course, you know, the supposition that this one bullet could do all this damage to two men and come out looking like it did is, of course, the magic bullet theory, which is total nonsense. But as far as juicy details,
wait. This is Arlen Specter, my home state, Pennsylvania. His greatest invention, the single bullet theory. Can you describe a little bit how Arlen Specter said this one, where it came in and where it moved to?
Yeah. So apparently the magic bullet, right? It came out looking as close to normal as you can get pre-firing. It was bowed just a little bit, but other than that, it was pristine looking, really. And allegedly, this bullet was fired from the 6th floor of the depository into Kennedy's back, a couple inches below his neck. And it traversed through Kennedy without hitting any bones and somehow exited his throat area and then proceeded to tumble. And it apparently went into Connolly long ways instead of like dead on. So it kind of went into Connolly sideways and went through and broke his ribs, went through his lung, exited his chest, went through his wrist, broke a bone in his wrist, and then finally came to rest in his thigh.
And wasn't Connolly holding his hat or something? Or is that Kennedy I'm thinking of?
Yeah, you're right. Connolly was holding his hat. But yeah, this one bullet created 7 wounds in 2 men and came out looking like it did. And the funny thing is that the Warren Commission hired an expert, a ballistics expert, to fire Mannlicher Carcano rounds into cadavers of pigs, goats, whatever, to see if they could replicate a bullet coming out looking like this. He fired 100 shots at dead carcasses, trying to go through the leg bones, the ribs, everything. Not one bullet came out looking like the magic bullet. Most of the time, 90% of the bullets came out mushroomed, where they look smushed and deformed because they've hit something hard, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And anybody that hunts will tell you, if you show them the magic bullet, that bullet didn't hit anything except water, air, or cotton, or gel. That's it.
Isn't it odd the way Oswald, he leaves his wallet, he leaves all these things at the Tippett scene? What do we know about the sniper's nest and what was left there in the book depository?
Up in the 6th floor in the quote unquote sniper's nest, which was not actually a sniper's nest, but it was created because they were replacing the floors on the 6th floor. On the day of the assassination, there was a crew up on the 6th floor replacing the floors because whatever, I think it was the air conditioning factory before it housed the book depository. And the floors were very oily. So they were having problems with this oil seeping up into the book cartons and damaging them. So they were going up floor by floor. They had already done the 5th floor, and now they were on the 6th floor, and they're laying down new plywood floors. Okay. And this floor laying crew consisted of, I think, 6 people. One of them was Billy Lovelady, the guy in the doorway. Another one was their supervisor, Oswald's supervisor, Bill Shelley, and 3 or 4 other guys. And of course, if you're going to fix a floor, okay, you have to clear out space. So you're going to pick up these stacks of books and you're going to move them to the edges of the building and stack them up high. So you have room to replace the floor, right?
Exactly.
So if you're replacing plywood floors at a time, you need, 4 by 8 feet of blank space to just put one sheet down. And as they're moving around the floor, of course, they have to keep moving the boxes around to be out of the way. So this is just the configuration that it happened to be at that time. It wasn't actually constructed as a quote unquote sniper's nest. So that's a big misconception that's out there. I forget what the direction of your question.
Was there any other evidence? Did he leave anything else there?
Yes. Allegedly, there were 3 rifle holes or shells that had been ejected from a Mannlicher Carcano, arrayed on the floor there in front of the window at the very southwest corner, which was where he was allegedly shooting from. Also, there was a paper bag found folded up and stuffed either in between the boxes or on the floor. We have pictures of the shells, but no pictures of the bag. He was alleged to have brought the rifle to work that day in a brown paper bag. The paper bag that we have pictures of the cops bringing out of the schoolbook depository is enormous. And I mean, huge. They bring it out on a stick. And this thing is at full glory. It looks like a flag. Then there's another paper bag introduced into the evidence, and somehow this all gets mixed up and tested at the FBI lab and doesn't match the paper they used to wrap the cartons at the schoolbook depository. So where does this paper come from? And of course, there's discrepancies with the size of the package when it comes to the guy who brought Oswald to work that day, Bill Frazier. He said that the package that Oswald had was only 2 feet, maybe 28 inches in length, but the Mannlicher Carcano in question was approximately fully put together. It was, I think, 39, almost 40 inches. Even if you took the barrel off of the stock itself was still at least 34 inches long. I mean, you can't break down the stock because it's solid wood. Even the longest part of the gun wouldn't have fit in a 28-inch package. So either Frazier was, and I don't think he was mistaken. So I think either lying about the size of the package or he just made it up. So he couldn't be associated with knowing that Oswald could have possibly brought a rifle to work that day.
Yeah, that makes sense as to why he would lie.
Yeah, you want to distance yourself as far as you could from this guy.
Right.
I mean, and they treated him horribly. I mean, because they arrested Frazier that afternoon. They went and he was at the hospital visiting his stepfather, apparently for 3 hours after the assassination. Because, that's what you do when you get let off work early. You go visit your stepfather, who you don't like, for 3 hours. But okay. So anyway, they find him there. They arrest him. They bring him down to the station and they question him. And he tells them the curtain rod story. And he leaves. Well, then they interview Oswald, and Oswald denies the curtain rod story. He said, I never said I had curtain rods. I didn't have any package. What are you talking about? I had my lunch. That was it. So they go back and they arrest Frazier again. They bring him back down to the station. And according to Frazier, they had a confession typed up that they wanted him to sign, which he refused to sign. And he said he almost got in a fight with the homicide chief, Captain Fritz. He said he was about ready to throw blows with him. And then somebody intervened. They even gave him a lie detector test. And then after that, they finally cut him loose at almost midnight on Friday night. But he was arrested initially as an accomplice. So, yeah, you're going to want to distance yourself from this guy as much as possible.
Wow. What do we know about Oswald's interrogation? Is any of that recorded? Do the notes exist?
Oh, my gosh. If only it was recorded. That would be amazing. But of course, Roberta. It was not. Because
Right.
why would you? You know, I mean, you have right here your prime suspect in the murder of the president, and you have all these news people with all these recording audio tape devices and cameras, but you don't utilize anything.
You have the most famous suspect you've probably ever had in your life in the Dallas Police Department.
Right.
Right.
All you had to do was walk out the door, grab one of the guys with the camera out there and say, "Get in here. You're taping this for us." I mean, but yeah, no. Sadly, no. That did not happen. So all we have to go by are contemporaneous notes, okay? And there's several versions of the Oswald interrogation notes by different individuals. You have Captain Fritz's notes, who was the homicide detective chief, who did not make notes while he's interviewing Oswald. He made his notes 3 days after Oswald was killed because he knew that he would be called to possibly testify about what Oswald said. So he wanted to write it down before he forgot. Okay. If you believe that one.
3 days later. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So then we have FBI agents Lookout and Hosty. And for some reason, they had the postal inspector there because apparently he was a big deal in Dallas. Harry Holmes was the postal inspector. And for some reason, he was there interrogating us at the Oswald interrogations. You have his notes.
Wait. A post office inspector?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why was he there? I don't even understand that.
Well, I think it was because he may have been an FBI informant.
Okay.
And probably knew some things about Oswald. And there's a very interesting piece of mail. Remind yourself to ask me about that here in a second. But so the notes, they ended up finding, and one of my friends, Bart Camp, who's a very good researcher from the UK, has done some excellent work on the Oswald interrogations. And he actually found another set of bookout notes that were written on the back of like an investigative form. So you know that they were taken down on anything they could find, basically. And it's interesting because when they asked Oswald where he was during the assassination, in Captain Fritz's notes, it says, "Out with Bill Shelley in front, watching the presidential parade." Okay.
Huh.
Interesting, right?
Right.
So, okay, you could think, okay, well, that's in one person's notes. It's not in anybody else's. So did he really say that or not? You know, so Bart found this other set of notes from FBI guy Bookout. And it states in there, Oswald said he was out front watching the presidential parade at the time of the shots. Okay.
Consistent.
And Captain Fritz's notes were not anywhere until somehow they came out of the assassination records and review boards in the 90s. So they didn't come out until 30 years after he allegedly made them. And nobody knows where they came from. They just were released. And then Bart found these bookout notes in researcher Malcolm Blunt's one of his several bags that he's been uploading files from that he got from the National Archives. It's just crazy that he found all this stuff and that Oswald gave them an alibi, but they denied him that alibi.
What was his alibi?
That he was out front with Bill Shelley watching the presidential parade. And there's even some, quote, evidence about this, you know, that has been put forth out there called Prayer Man. Okay. Now, Prayer Man is this individual who was caught on video. I think it's the Darnell film or the Wigman film. And these two guys were local Dallas newsmen, and they were in one of the follow-up cars in the presidential motorcade. And as they are going through Dealey Plaza, they're filming. They're following the same route. As they turn that corner on Elm Street, there's a figure standing in the doorway of the school book depository that looks a hell of a lot like Lee Harvey Oswald. It's very hard to make out. It's not 100%. Like you couldn't look at it and say, okay, definitely that's Lee Oswald. But whoever it is unaccounted for. And it's not Billy Lovelady because he's in the photo too. So it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I remember when you had a episode about Prayer Man, and I went to the website. It's a really hard picture, though. I mean, it's a really faint picture. No,
it is.
Right, yeah.
It is, but you know, it's an unaccounted for because trust me, these researchers, they dig. When you figure out who all the depository employees were, because more than likely, if somebody is on the top steps or this top step or porch there of the doorway, it's not some random passerby. Okay. It's going to be an employee who has just come out the door to watch the parade. And if he's behind everybody else, nobody's going to see him. And he doesn't even have to be standing outside, because right there in the doorway, it's all glass. So there's a glass vestibule, and that figure could even be behind the glass. He doesn't have to be outside.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, very interesting stuff, because Oswald always said, "Where were you?" He said, "I ate my lunch on the first floor and all this." And there was a guy up on the 6th floor up until 12:25 p.m. eating his lunch, named Bonnie Ray Williams, because they found chicken bones and a Dr. Pepper and some cigarette butts up there that they thought was Oswald's. Well, no, it turns out it was this other guy, Bonnie Ray Williams, who sat up there on the 6th floor, kind of right in the middle of it, and ate his chicken sandwich and drank his soda and smoked a couple cigarettes. And then he went down one floor and watched the motorcade, 2 of his other friends on the 5th floor, hanging out of the 5th floor windows. Now, we do have pictures of that. So that's where he was, but he didn't come down there but 5 minutes before the assassination happened. So is Oswald sitting over in the corner the whole time, sweating bullets, hoping this guy will leave? Or I highly doubt it.
That's crazy. I'd just like to run by some alternative theories that aren't the lone gunman theory. So one is that the mob did it, that the mob likes to kill in public, that Kennedy was killed in public, that Ruby and his connections to the mob, that the mob were angry because they helped Kennedy get elected by stuffing the ballot boxes in Chicago, and that his brother is cracking down on them. What do you think of the mob did it alone theory?
It's very interesting. It's got teeth, but again, the mob's not known for long range assassinations. They're more of an up close and personal kind of thing. Think Jimmy Hoffa. We do know through declassified files that the CIA was using the mafia through various figures like Johnny Rosselli to try to assassinate Fidel Castro. And we're talking through people like Santos Trafficante in Florida and Sam Giancana in Chicago. These names keep popping up. And then you got Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, whose name keeps popping up, who David Ferrie worked for as an investigator, as part of his legal team. Bobby Kennedy had Carlos Marcello sent down to Guatemala and dropped in the middle of nowhere in a jungle somewhere. He had to make his way out of there and get back to the United States. Did that piss him off? Probably. I mean, it wouldn't me.
One of the big proponents of this mob theory, Wim Dankbar, is that his name? Is that close?
There is a fellow named that, yeah.
Who promotes the...
James Files.
Thank you. I totally fell for that. James Files BS in the beginning.
Don't feel bad, because a lot of people did fall for it and still do fall for it.
We're talking about a true crime story. The JFK assassination, I consider it one of our oldest cold cases. Even if you could say that Oswald did it alone, it's still, Oswald was never tried. It's still open. Right. Nobody's been convicted of the crime.
Right.
You guys have in the JFK community so much of what's going on in the true crime community, even though they're overlapped, is this sort of like money grabs. These fraudulent money grabs. They're always very simple stories, easy to understand. What is James Files' fraudulent story? Why would one call it that?
Well, I think there's several reasons that this happens, and it's not just money. People just have a desire to be famous or insert themselves in history, or it's a mental illness of some sort. I have not figured it out yet. But with James Files, he supposedly worked for Chicago mobster Chucky Nicoletti.
Good memory.
He was in prison in the early 90s for something. I can't remember what, but he had been in prison for a while. And apparently somebody at the prison, I think it was a guard or somebody, reached out to, a Kennedy researcher that this guy had information. So they went and interviewed him, and he starts telling them this story about he was sent to Dallas by Chucky Nicoletti, and him and a buddy, and his buddy shot Tippett. James Files was behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll with an experimental CIA Remington Fireball handgun. It had a very long barrel, and it was sighted with a scope, much like a rifle is, but it was technically a handgun. very powerful weapon, deadly accurate, but it hadn't been released to the public at that point yet. So apparently he had a CIA prototype. Okay. He claims to have left a shell that he bit down on after he took the shot, and he said he left it on the fence there. Of course, some years later they find this bit down on rifle shell there, but it turns out that it couldn't have been that because it wasn't manufactured until a certain date, so that fell apart. But this guy apparently, and he may have been part of the mafia in Chicago with Chucky Nicoletti and Sam Giancana. I don't know. But these people think that they can, because they're close to certain parts of history, that they can insert themselves in other parts of history. Mm. I think he saw an opportunity. I think he read a lot of books while he was in prison, and he saw an opening and possibly have thought that maybe if I have this information, he could leverage an early release. Mm. Hey, I got this information about the Kennedy assassination. You let me out of here and I'll tell you whatever. Of course, that never happened. So it turned into I'll tell you whatever. So, that theory was pushed out there. And look, I went to Dallas in 2019, Roberta. Okay. And I'm up on the grassy knoll. I'm behind the picket fence. And I look up and damned if James Files isn't standing right there.
No way.
And I was like, James Files? And he was like, yes, sir. And I said, oh, nice to meet you. I'm Rob Clark. I do the Lone Gunman podcast. And he's like, yeah, I've heard of that.
No way.
Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, all right, this is crazy. So I sat there and I talked to him for a couple of minutes and he went on his way. I said, what are you doing here? I'm just here like everybody else. And he wasn't appearing at any conferences. He wasn't speaking at any conferences. And he had apparently just got out of prison.
Was it Kevin Costner or Oliver Stone who wanted his story?
It had to be Oliver.
I thought it was Oliver. And he said, I didn't make a deal because I didn't like him. I was like, I don't know if I believe that. Even I was skeptical of that claim while I was being duped by his ridiculous story. Speaking of inserting themselves into history, there's also the LBJ did it. He had the most to gain. And Wallace is Roger Stone pushed this theory in his book. Wallace as the shooter, LBJ as the really wanted to be president. And this was basically, right, an overthrow of power by a jealous vice president.
Right. I'm sure LBJ had some jealousy. He's the vice president for these two handsome young Kennedy brothers and probably knows that the only reason he's in there is because he's from Texas. They needed that state. I'm sure he held some resentment for him. Of course, he was a power-hungry guy. He wanted to be governor, vice president, of course. So the theory goes that his personal hitman, a guy he had who was working for him named Malcolm Wallace, was up on the 6th floor shooting and, actually killed Kennedy. And that his fingerprints were found in the 6th floor on one of the book cartons. Okay, well, that seems like pretty good evidence, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you have this Mac Wallace guy's fingerprints. What the hell are they doing there? Thankfully, another researcher, Joan Mellon,
who's a professor at Temple University,
yes, had that fingerprint reanalyzed with actual good fingerprints of Malcolm Wallace, and it was determined that they were not a match. So that theory can go right out the window. Okay. Now, was LBJ a good guy? Probably not. I can tell you he wasn't. And the whole theory that he wanted to do this because he wanted to be president so bad. Well, if he wanted to be president so bad, why didn't he run again?
And he also had that woman, was her last name Brown, who came out and said she had an affair with him and that she saw him setting up the... Can you talk about her story a little bit?
Yes, Madeline Duncan Brown. So apparently she was one of our LBJ's mistresses, and he probably did have a kid with her. I mean, if you look at their kid, he does look a lot like LBJ. Again, I think this was a woman close to history, probably upset that LBJ didn't acknowledge the fact that he had a kid with her or had a tryst with her. And she was probably bitter, about some things, and decided, okay, well, I've heard rumors about this. I can say I was there and he said this and he said that. She wrote a book and the whole 9 yards, did the conference tour in the 90s and did all these interviews. And, it turns out that she was probably Judith Baker before Judith Baker was Judith Baker. Just one of those persons with a story. A lot of what she said didn't make sense. It didn't pan out. I mean, she named everybody and their brother being at this party the night before the assassination at H.L. Hunt's ranch or something. You know, it turns out that you could debunk half of the people she said were there. They weren't anywhere near there. So, yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy to debunk a lot of these people. You still have these blind faith believers, and I just don't get it.
Tons of these sort of fraudulent stories that can be debunked, yet they go on, and that they still have an audience. And no one is probably done a better job of taking her story and making it pay than Judith Vary Baker. Who is she, and what is her story?
Oh, boy. Judith Baker happened to be in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. And she was there, I guess, to go to school at Tulane. I think it was at Tulane under Alton Ochsner, who has been tried to be tied to all this as well, but we'll get there, who allegedly met Lee Oswald in the post office there as when she dropped a piece of her mail, and she said thank you in Russian, and he answered her in Russian, and you know, she looked into his eyes, and immediately fell in love.
Who would have want to be speaking Russian in the height of the Cold War in a post office in a strange town? Yeah.
Right. So then they allegedly have this torrid love affair in the summer of 1963, despite Oswald still being married to Marina, her being pregnant, and them actually still living together in New Orleans, despite him being home every night. She does have some records. She happened to get a job at the Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans at the same time that Oswald was there.
And that was the acorn that grew a great oak, a great fraudulent oak.
Yep, pretty much. And from there, it has been downhill ever since. She came out in the late 90s. Deborah Conway of JFK Lancer, a pretty respected group, bought her story and started promoting her until several researchers started pointing out the problems with her story. Then she was kind of shunned by the community, but still she persisted. She kept putting manuscripts out there that exist, very early versions of her book, Me and Lee. And of course, you know, facts and circumstances changed throughout the years and this, that, and the other. You know, she claims that all of her evidence was destroyed in a fire. You know, she used to have letters from Lee and notes from him, love letters.
Is the shower shoes still there?
The flip-flops?
Yeah, the flip-flops. His moldy flip-flops. Who wouldn't want to keep those?
10-cent flip-flops that anybody could buy at the 10-cent store back then? Sure.
Yeah, it's like a drinking glass and flip-flops, right? I think is what she has.
Yeah, anybody got that glass out of if they bought the right thing of coffee. I mean, it's just.
But she's got a witness, Anna
Lewis,
who backs up her story. What's wrong with that?
Gets several facts wrong in her interview. She gets the years mixed up.
What happened to Judith Baker when she was supposed to be part of a 60 Minutes? Is that right? About JFK?
Yeah, it was a 60 Minutes. Yeah, and they determined that her story was fraudulent, so they didn't put her on the air. That's what happened. She wrote them a letter at the time kind of explaining her relationship with Oswald, what they were up to, and this and that. And then at that point, they were like, okay, yeah, no, we can't do this. We can't put this woman on TV. But of course, it was, in her eyes, it's something nefarious. They're trying to bury the truth and this and that.
She's also famously pictured in a Vice celebrating Oswald's birthday with a group of other JFK researchers. Every year they pay tribute to Oswald because isn't her theory that Oswald was purposely trying to miss?
Yes, he was a CIA agent who tried to prevent the assassination and purposely missed. Yes.
All for love.
Oh, yeah.
It's just amazing. But she does her own conference. So we can laugh about Judith Vary Baker, but she has some power in your community, no?
Unfortunately, yes. She has risen through the ranks. I've seen it in just a short period of time. I went to a conference in 2014 in DC. Judith was there and she was doing a talk at the conference. I got to meet her and talk with her there.
You said she was very nice.
She was very nice. She's very nice until you disagree with her and you start questioning her. Because she obviously believes what she's saying. She's obviously been over this stuff so much, she has convinced herself that all this is real and all this happened. I mean, she's a victim of conviction, and it's some kind of mental illness. It has to be, you know, where if you say something so often and repeat it so often, it starts to become real to you, you know, like you convince yourself that this really happened. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where she's at. And she has managed to weasel her way up the ranks of JFK researchers and conference patrons, people with big money that put these conferences on, to put her out there and give her a platform. I think it was somewhere around the 50th anniversary is when she started. Well, no, it had to be later than that. But she started weaseling her way into running her own conference. And it was around the time that Kappa stopped doing conferences and Lancer was not doing one. So she had the perfect opportunity to step in and start doing one. Because, look, some people want to go to JFK conferences in Dallas, around the time of the assassination. And if that's the only one in town, guess what? You're going. People weren't left with much of an option. And then, of course, a couple of years ago, Lancer stopped doing their thing. It's a very weird scene, to be honest with you. The whole JFK conference scene, it's very, very weird. I said, when I went down there in 2019 to see her and Beverly Oliver on the grassy knoll leading a prayer and singing songs in remembrance of Kennedy, it's mind-blowing. Because I think they're both frauds, okay? Beverly Oliver said she was the babushka lady in Dealey Plaza, okay? She's another one. The surreal scene, it hit me that day, and I'm sitting there watching this. I'm like, are you freaking serious? Like, this is what it's come to. And sadly, yes. There's people still ready to eat up their story, clapping them. Oh, yeah, Judy, we love you, Judy. It's just like, oh my God.
And she's been debunked 6 ways to Sunday. You've debunked her. You've done 2 great episodes, Punching Judy and Punching Judy Part 2, where you go through exactly where Oswald was. They know through the Warren Commission, put Oswald in all these different places. And Judith Vary Baker has him, when he's looking for a job, she has him off with her in the park, romancing. It's just, there people have done really great essays about this shop that Reverend Jim's shop. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And yet she still goes on, like, all her stories haven't already crumbled. Her story about living in Sweden in exile is totally fallen apart. And yet she goes on. It's not that she hasn't been exposed. She's been exposed. But if you're a JFK researcher and you want exposure, you're going to have to kiss some frogs, kiss some frauds in this case, or kiss up to some frauds if you want to sell your book, unfortunately, if she's the only game in town.
Exactly.
Scary situation for sure. In one of your episodes, I think it's your first Punching Judy episode, you go through the top. When did you do that episode? Maybe 2016? Maybe earlier, 15?
It's been a while. It's one of the older ones.
Yeah, it's a great episode. I've listened to it quite a few times. You start talking about the books that are at the top of the JFK research. JFK and the Unspeakable, good book, should be on there. And the fraudulent books seem to go all the way to the top. Why is that?
Because it's a good story. That's why. Everybody loves a good story, Roberta. Mm-hmm. Especially a good love story, Who doesn't love a good story? And on its own, if it was written as a fiction novel, hey, more power to you. Great job, Judy. I'll give you a round of applause on that. But to present it as fact and actual history, not so much.
It's like you're absolutely right. She could write great fan fiction, romance fan fiction for JFK, right. Or even you could call it Oswald romance fiction.
Right.
So you've quit your podcast a couple of times and come back, probably quit and come back more times than Sinatra retired and came back. What makes you quit? What's the frustration, or what's the thing that makes you quit, and what's the thing that makes you come back?
Well, doing this for, 30 some years now, looking into this, sometimes you suffer from burnout. And some of the things that are contemporaneously happening makes me really tired. I feel the need, since I have a platform, to try to unmuddy the water sometimes. And that entails dealing with people like Judy Baker, with Beverly Oliver, and, the list goes on, James Files, Mac Wallace, to try to unmuddy the water to get back to, okay, this is what we need to focus on. Not all this crap, because this has all been debunked before. It was technical issues. I get frustrated because back in the day, it was very hard to be able to do this on my own and basically find a third party way to record a conversation on Skype. I mean, I've been sitting in my car at 2:00 in the morning talking to somebody in Australia, okay, on my cell phone and recording it with a handheld digital recorder. And it probably sounded like crap. As a podcaster, one of the biggest frustrations, and I love to listen to podcasts, and one of the biggest frustrations is when you're listening to a podcast is auditory issues. And I know that. I get frustrated sometimes when I can't find a good solution to my problem of having my show sound good. And, you know, in the past couple of years, you know, it's getting a great microphone. Skype now has the built-in ability to record, or there's Zoom, there's StreamYard. There's so many more options now to make everything sound so much better, to be listenable to your audience and not have them get 10 minutes in and be like, I can't take this static shit anymore. I'm turning it off. I would get frustrated, you know?
Right. I love when people come to New York and they ask me where my studio is. It's like, there's no room. You're going to hear the car sounds. You're going to hear, you know, we don't have a recording studio, even with these things. And I understand the frustration for sure. I'm always so happy when you come back, and I hope you'll come back. Still so much to talk about. People who are interested in the real deal, real researcher, and who's searching for the truth. Even if you're not interested in the JFK subject, I highly recommend this podcast. Rob has a really nice laid-back style. I never miss it. I always find it fascinating. Lone Gunman Podcast. Rob Clark, where can people find you?
Thank you so much for having me on. You're too kind. I appreciate you for being a great fan and listener for so many years. And it's a great honor for me to come on your show that I've listened to for many years and enjoy. So it's a big honor for me just to be here. Thank you. Thank you again for having me. If people are interested in hearing more, if you really want to get in the weeds and get into some details that you probably never wanted to hear before, you know, we get in the weeds over here at the Lone Gunman Podcast, and you can listen just about anywhere nowadays. I mean, it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts. It's everywhere. YouTube, you name it, I'm there. Just Google the Lone Gunman Podcast. And I also do another show with my buddy Doug Campbell, who's the host of the Dallas Action. It's called Quick Hits, a JFK assassination news and notes podcast. And you can find that as well. It's a little bit more funny and entertaining than normal show. We do that together, and it's a lot of fun to do. Yeah, and you can find that anywhere. You can find the Lone Gunman, or you can find the Roberta Glass True Crime Report. You can listen to me and Doug and Roberta all on the same app, probably.
Rob Clark, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you again for having me. It's been a true pleasure, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Looking forward to doing it again.
Oh, me too. We have so much to talk about.